Snow descended upon London with the hush of a funeral veil, softening the iron streets and silvering the windows of Ashcombe House while servants hurried through glowing corridors carrying armfuls of satin, pearls, and winter roses. By nightfall, the city's nobility would gather beneath the crystal chandeliers of Blackthorn Manor for the season's grandest ball, an occasion whispered about for weeks in drawing rooms scented with cigar smoke and lavender powder. Yet within the quiet chambers overlooking Belgrave Square, Lady Eleanor Ashcombe stood motionless before her mirror with one trembling hand pressed discreetly against the gentle curve hidden beneath her corseted gown. The ivory silk fitted her elegantly, though her maid's careful lacing could not soothe the dread tightening within her chest. Eleanor had once adored such evenings. She had once believed marriage transformed ballrooms into sanctuaries where a husband's glance alone could outshine every candle in the room. Tonight, however, the reflection staring back at her seemed pale with apprehension rather than anticipation. The diamonds around her throat belonged to the Ravensshire family, yet they felt colder than chains. "You are unwell," murmured Lady Beatrice Whitmore from the doorway. Eleanor managed a faint smile. "Only weary." Beatrice crossed the room, auburn skirts whispering against the carpet. Unlike the women of London society who sharpened gossip into weapons, Beatrice possessed the rare gift of honesty. Her eyes softened as they settled upon Eleanor's guarded expression. "He has scarcely spoken to you these past weeks," she said quietly. "If tonight becomes unbearable, you must leave with me at once." Eleanor lowered her gaze toward the flickering fire. A wife cannot flee discomfort each time her husband grows distant. But neither should she endure cruelty merely because society expects silence. The words lingered heavily after Beatrice departed. Eleanor remained still long after the carriage lamps appeared below the windows. She had not yet told Cedric about the child. Fear had delayed her confession day after day until secrecy itself became a torment. Once she would have rushed breathlessly into his arms with the news. Once his laughter had filled corridors like music. Yet the Duke of Ravensshire had become a stranger within their marriage, a man increasingly consumed by cold restraint and endless obligations. Blackthorn Manor glittered like a palace carved from ice. Carriages lined the snowy avenue while liveried footmen guided jeweled aristocrats through towering bronze doors. Inside, violins drifted beneath painted ceilings where cherubs floated among clouds touched with gold leaf. The ballroom shimmered with silk gowns, military decorations, polished marble, and crystal stemware reflecting 1,000 flames. When Eleanor entered upon Cedric's arm, conversations briefly faltered. The Duke stood devastatingly handsome in black evening attire adorned with silver embroidery, his sharp features carrying the severe beauty of a marble statue. Women admired him openly despite the forbidding distance in his expression. Men respected him with equal parts envy and caution. Yet while society saw power, Eleanor saw exhaustion lingering beneath his composure like a concealed wound. Almost immediately he drifted away. He spoke with politicians beside the orchestra. He bowed before dowagers requesting dances for their daughters. He scarcely glanced toward his wife except through brief, unreadable looks that vanished before she could interpret them. Whispers soon fluttered through the ballroom like poisonous moths. "Poor Duchess Ravensshire. They say the marriage grows colder by the month. No heir yet either. How unfortunate." Countess Mortimer delivered the remarks behind an ivory fan, though not softly enough to escape Eleanor's hearing. Humiliation burned beneath Eleanor's skin, but years within aristocratic society had taught her the discipline of graceful suffering. She lifted her chin and continued smiling while her heart quietly fractured beneath layers of satin and etiquette. At midnight the orchestra began a waltz. Cedric finally approached her near the grand staircase. Candlelight flickered across his stern face as he extended his hand with formal politeness. "You have avoided me all evening," Eleanor whispered while they danced. "Have entertained guests. You have entertained everyone except your wife." His jaw tightened slightly. "This is neither the time nor place." For a moment she nearly retreated into silence again. Yet the child growing within her suddenly felt impossibly fragile amid the cruelty surrounding them. Fear gave way to desperation. "There is something you must know," she murmured shakily. "Cedric, I am carrying your child." The dance continued around them, glittering and oblivious. Cedric stopped moving. A terrible stillness entered his eyes, as though some private terror had reached through the music and seized him by the throat. Eleanor waited for warmth, astonishment, perhaps even relief. Instead, his expression hardened with unmistakable dread. "I do not want this child." The 5 words fell softly between them, yet they shattered the ballroom more completely than a gunshot. Nearby conversations dissolved into silence. A lady dropped her fan. Someone turned away awkwardly while Countess Mortimer stared with open fascination. Eleanor could scarcely breathe. The violins continued playing, absurdly cheerful against the ruin unfolding beneath the chandeliers. Cedric seemed to realize too late what he had done. Regret flickered across his face, swift and tortured, but pride sealed his mouth before apology could emerge. Eleanor stepped backward slowly, her vision blurring beneath unshed tears. Every whisper in London suddenly felt alive around her, circling like wolves scenting blood upon snow. Without another word, she turned and descended the staircase alone while hundreds of aristocratic eyes followed her departure in merciless silence. Hours later, long after the final carriage departed Blackthorn Manor, Cedric entered his own carriage beneath the freezing dawn. The interior remained dark except for the faint glow spilling through frosted windows. At first he believed Eleanor had already returned home. Then he noticed the wedding ring resting upon the velvet seat beside him. Outside, church bells echoed while Cedric stared at the abandoned ring in stunned silence. For the first time that night, the Duke of Ravensshire understood humiliation could wound more deeply than hatred, and some words once spoken could never be recalled. Rain haunted Ravensshire estate for 3 relentless days after the ball at Blackthorn Manor, turning the sprawling gardens into drowned mirrors of winter branches and blackened roses. Curtains remained drawn across the eastern wing where Eleanor secluded herself from servants, visitors, and most painfully from her husband. Even the fireplaces seemed reluctant to burn brightly within those silent chambers, as though the entire manor had absorbed the sorrow carried home beneath the snow. London, meanwhile, fed greedily upon her humiliation. Every drawing room from Mayfair to Kensington repeated the same dreadful story. Some claimed the Duchess of Ravensshire had collapsed in tears before the orchestra. Others insisted the Duke despised the prospect of fatherhood because he maintained a mistress hidden somewhere along the French coast. The crueler versions traveled fastest. By the week's end, Countess Mortimer had transformed private agony into fashionable entertainment among the aristocracy. Cedric heard the whispers everywhere. He heard them inside Parliament corridors lined with portraits of dead statesmen. He heard them beside gentlemen's club fireplaces where cigar smoke drifted through polished oak rooms. He heard them in the sudden silences that followed his arrival at dinner parties. Yet none of society's judgment pierced him as sharply as the memory of Eleanor's face when he had spoken those unforgivable words. He scarcely slept. Near dawn on the 4th morning, Cedric entered the conservatory carrying a cluster of rare white roses imported from Vienna. Rain slid across the glass ceiling above him while servants quietly trimmed frost-damaged orchids nearby. The flowers had once been Eleanor's favorites during their courtship. She used to tuck individual petals into novels and letters until every page carried their fragrance. Her Grace will not receive gifts, the housekeeper informed him carefully. Cedric stared at the roses. Leave them outside her door regardless. The flowers remained untouched all day. By evening, he sent a velvet case containing a sapphire necklace that had belonged to his grandmother, one of the most treasured heirlooms within the Ravensshire family. Eleanor returned it unopened before supper. The following morning came handwritten poetry copied carefully in Cedric's own restrained script. She burned the pages without reading them fully. Only one offering escaped rejection. Late one storm-heavy afternoon, a maid entered Eleanor's chambers carrying a tiny carved wooden bird no larger than her palm. The rough edges and imperfect wings revealed it had been shaped by unpracticed hands many years earlier. He says he made it as a child, the maid whispered. Eleanor dismissed the servants before touching the little bird. Cedric had once confessed, during the earliest days of their marriage, that lonely winters at boarding school drove him toward strange hobbies meant to silence isolation. She remembered laughing softly while he carved beside the library fire, his usually severe expression briefly transformed by shy concentration. For the first time since the ball, tears slipped quietly down her cheeks. That evening, Beatrice visited carrying London newspapers folded beneath her arm. "You must stop reading these dreadful things," she urged while tossing them aside. "Society grows bored eventually." "Not when misery belongs to a duchess," Eleanor replied faintly. Beatrice hesitated before speaking again. "There are uglier rumors now." Eleanor looked toward the rain-streaked windows. "About another woman?" "Yes." Though her voice remained composed, Eleanor's hand instinctively moved across the hidden curve beneath her gown. Something inside her hardened then, not with fury but with exhaustion. Love could survive coldness for astonishing lengths of time. Humiliation, however, slowly poisoned even devotion. After Beatrice departed, Eleanor unlocked a small writing desk beside the fireplace and withdrew maps, travel schedules, and several letters addressed to distant relatives in northern Scotland. She began quietly arranging a future beyond Ravensshire estate, one where her child might grow untouched by whispers and loveless grandeur. The storm intensified after midnight. Unable to sleep, Eleanor wandered downstairs wrapped in a silver dressing robe. Firelight flickered weakly through the great drawing room where rain hammered against tall windows overlooking the gardens. She stopped abruptly upon discovering Cedric asleep in an armchair beside the dying fire. Exhaustion had softened him. Without the rigid discipline he wore before society, he appeared younger, almost vulnerable. An open ledger rested across his lap beside untouched brandy. He must have been waiting for her. As Eleanor turned to leave quietly, Cedric stirred awake. For several moments neither spoke. Then he rose slowly and removed the wool blanket draped across the chair. "You should not be wandering cold corridors in your condition," he murmured. "My condition troubles you only after audiences have witnessed it." Pain flickered through his expression. Still, he stepped forward carefully and placed the blanket around her shoulders. His fingers brushed her skin only briefly, yet warmth traveled through her with dangerous familiarity. "You offered me jewels after breaking what could not be repaired with gold," she whispered. Cedric lowered his gaze. "If regret possessed a voice, Eleanor, it would sound very much like mine." The silence between them trembled with things neither dared confess. Rain thundered above the glass conservatory beyond the drawing room while distant lightning illuminated the estate in silver flashes. For one fragile instant, Eleanor almost leaned toward him. Then dizziness struck violently. Her knees weakened beneath her before Cedric caught her against his chest. Panic shattered his composure instantly as he carried her toward the sofa, calling for servants and physicians with a desperation the household had never heard from him before. An hour later, the family physician emerged from Eleanor's chambers with grave eyes and rainwater still glistening upon his coat. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "the Duchess must avoid distress entirely. Her pregnancy has become dangerously fragile." Cedric went utterly still. The physician hesitated before delivering the final blow. "If her suffering continues at this pace, you may lose both mother and child." Long after the physician departed, Cedric remained beneath the corridor lamps, staring at Eleanor's closed bedroom door while the echo of his cruelty transformed from pride into something close to murder. Snow buried Ravensshire estate beneath a silence so profound that even the servants lowered their voices instinctively while passing through its endless corridors. Winter sunlight rarely penetrated the heavy clouds gathering above the moors, and by late afternoon the manor dissolved into shadows lit only by fireplaces and trembling candle flames. The world beyond the estate seemed distant now, reduced to muffled carriage wheels and occasional letters arriving from London filled with gossip no one dared read aloud before the Duchess. Eleanor spent most hours confined to her chambers overlooking the frozen gardens. The physician's warnings had transformed her pregnancy into a fragile imprisonment guarded by tonics, blankets, and constant supervision. Yet physical weakness troubled her less than the quiet ache lingering within her chest whenever Cedric entered the room carrying the careful expression of a condemned man approaching judgment. He no longer avoided her. Each morning he appeared beside her breakfast tray, ensuring the tea remained warm enough and the curtains opened only partially against the harsh winter glare. At night he sat silently near the fireplace while she rested upon the chaise lounge, reading correspondence he scarcely seemed to comprehend. Their conversations remained brief, restrained by old wounds neither knew how to cross safely. Still, something had shifted. The cruelty once hardening Cedric's features had given way to exhaustion threaded with remorse. Eleanor observed it in the shadows beneath his eyes, in the way his hands tightened whenever she coughed, and most painfully, in the tenderness he attempted to conceal whenever he believed her asleep. One evening she awakened near midnight to discover him kneeling beside the hearth adjusting the firewood carefully so the room would not grow cold before dawn. Golden light flickered across his face while snow drifted outside the tall windows like scattered ashes. "You need not linger here endlessly," she murmured weakly. Cedric looked toward her at once. "The physician instructed that you should not remain unattended. You are a duke, not a nursemaid." "No," he replied quietly. "Only a husband attempting unsuccessfully to repair what he has destroyed." The honesty in his voice unsettled her more than anger would have. Eleanor slowly sat upright against the cushions while silence gathered between them. At last she asked the question haunting every sleepless night since the ball. "Why?" Cedric remained motionless. "You looked at me," she continued softly, "as though I had placed a curse upon your life rather than offered you a child. I deserve the truth, Cedric, even if it wounds me further." For several moments only the fire answered her. Then Cedric rose and crossed toward the window where snowlight silvered the glass. "My father despised weakness," he said at last, "especially within himself. He believed affection made men vulnerable, so he ruled this estate through fear instead. Servants trembled when he entered rooms. My mother endured his cruelty with silence because aristocratic marriages were built upon appearances rather than kindness." Eleanor listened quietly while his voice grew distant with memory. "When I was 11, I fell from a horse during winter hunting. The physician believed my leg broken. A bitter smile touched his mouth briefly. My father informed me that Ravensshire men did not cry. He left me lying in the snow until I learned the lesson properly. Pain tightened Eleanor's throat. Cedric lowered his gaze toward the frozen gardens below. I spent years convincing myself I had become stronger than him. Yet the moment you told me about the child, terror overtook reason entirely. I realized I knew nothing of tenderness, nothing of fatherhood except what had been inflicted upon me. You feared becoming him. Yes. The confession settled heavily between them. Cedric turned slowly toward her, his composure visibly fracturing for the first time since their marriage began. I believed distance would protect you from disappointment. I convinced myself you deserved better than a man incapable of warmth. Yet instead of sparing you pain, I became its source. Eleanor looked down at her trembling hands resting across her stomach. I could have endured loneliness, she whispered. Women endure such things every day within marriages like ours. But those 5 words, her voice faltered painfully. They shattered something inside me that once loved you without caution. Cedric closed his eyes briefly as though struck. I know. The storm outside intensified, snow striking the windows in restless waves while the fire crackled softly between them. Eleanor expected him to retreat again behind silence and pride. Instead, Cedric crossed the room and knelt before her chair with startling vulnerability. I have replayed that moment endlessly, he admitted hoarsely. Every hour since the ball. I hear your silence afterward more clearly than the words themselves. Before Eleanor could answer, he withdrew several folded papers from inside his coat pocket. I wrote these weeks ago, he said quietly. Before the ball. Before I lost whatever courage remained within me. Confused, Eleanor accepted the letters carefully. The first page contained uneven handwriting entirely unlike Cedric's usual immaculate script. To the child I have not yet earned the right to deserve. Eleanor's breath caught. Cedric stared into the fire rather than at her while she continued reading fragments aloud beneath trembling candlelight. I wonder whether your eyes shall resemble your mother's, she whispered from the page. If they do, perhaps the world will appear gentler to you than it ever did to me. Another letter spoke of teaching the child to ride horses across the northern hills. Another described bedtime stories Cedric remembered from his Scottish nursemaid before loneliness hardened the estate into cold ritual and expectation. By the third letter, Eleanor could no longer see clearly through her tears. You wrote these before rejecting us, she murmured. Cedric's voice broke softly. Because cowardice often destroys what the heart desires most. The room fell silent except for the storm. Slowly, almost unconsciously, Cedric reached for her hand resting against the blanket. His lips brushed her knuckles with devastating tenderness, lingering there as though reverence itself might heal old wounds. For one dangerous moment, Eleanor nearly forgave him entirely. Then fear returned just as swiftly. She withdrew her hand gently and looked away toward the fire. You wounded me most not because you lacked love, she whispered, but because you feared it. Cedric lowered his head in quiet defeat. Dawn's pale light eventually crept through the windows while exhaustion settled over the room like fog after battle. Neither had slept. At last Eleanor reached toward the small table beside her chair where Cedric's wedding ring still rested untouched since the night of the ball. Without speaking, she placed it softly into his palm. Hope flickered across his face so suddenly it almost resembled grief. Then Eleanor gasped sharply. Pain seized her abdomen with terrifying force, stealing the color from her face instantly. The letters slipped from her lap onto the carpet while Cedric surged forward in alarm. Another violent pain followed moments later. And this time, Eleanor began to bleed. Thunder rolled above Ravensshire estate with such violence that the ancient windows trembled within their frames while servants rushed frantically through candlelit corridors carrying basins of steaming water and armfuls of linen. Snow had turned to freezing rain by nightfall, lashing the manor like punishment from heaven itself. Every corridor smelled of smoke, medicine, and fear. Cedric remained beside Eleanor's bed while physicians worked around them with grave urgency. Her face had grown deathly pale against the white pillows, and every painful breath seemed to carve deeper terror into his chest. The sight of blood upon the sheets had shattered the final remnants of aristocratic restraint within him. Nothing remained now except desperate love stripped bare of pride. She must conserve her strength, warned Dr. Whitcomb quietly. The child comes far too early. Eleanor gripped the blankets weakly as another wave of agony overtook her. Yet even through unbearable pain, her eyes searched instinctively for Cedric. He moved to her side immediately, taking her trembling hand between both of his. I am here, he whispered. The words sounded painfully inadequate against her suffering. Hours passed beneath relentless storm clouds while the estate seemed suspended between life and ruin. Servants spoke in hushed prayers outside the chamber doors. Even the great clocks throughout the manor sounded mournful as midnight approached. At one point the Dowager Duchess Ravenshire swept into the room draped in severe black silk, her expression untouched by compassion. She regarded Eleanor not as a frightened young woman fighting for survival, but as a fragile vessel threatening the continuation of the family line. This would not have occurred, she declared coldly, had the Duchess possessed greater composure during recent scandals. Cedric rose so abruptly that nearby servants recoiled. "Leave this room immediately." His mother stared at him in astonishment. "You forget yourself." "No," Cedric answered, his voice low with fury. "For the first time in my life I remember precisely who I am." The Dowager Duchess glanced toward Eleanor with visible disapproval. "You disgrace this family by placing emotion above dignity." Cedric stepped closer, his eyes burning with a rage sharpened by years of buried resentment. "Dignity without kindness is merely cruelty wearing expensive clothing. If you cannot offer compassion tonight, then you shall offer silence elsewhere." The room fell utterly still. Never in living memory had the Duke of Ravensshire defied his mother publicly. For a long moment she appeared prepared to strike him with some cutting reply, yet something within his expression halted her completely. Without another word, she turned and swept from the chamber while thunder rattled the windows above them. Eleanor watched Cedric silently after the door closed. "You challenged her for me," she whispered faintly. "I should have done so years ago." Another contraction seized her before further conversation became possible. Cedric remained beside the bed throughout every cry of pain despite repeated suggestions from physicians that noblemen traditionally waited elsewhere during childbirth. He ignored them all without hesitation. Near dawn the storm worsened. Rain battered the manor roof while icy wind moaned through distant corridors like grieving spirits. Exhaustion consumed Eleanor gradually until even lifting her head became difficult. Cedric knelt beside the bed, brushing damp strands of hair from her forehead with heartbreaking gentleness. Fear transformed him visibly. The proud, emotionally guarded Duke admired by London society had vanished entirely, leaving only a terrified husband watching the woman he loved slip toward danger he could neither command nor fight. Eleanor studied his face through fading strength. "You once told me you did not want this child." The words pierced him instantly. Cedric lowered his head against her hand as though seeking absolution at an altar. When he finally looked upward again, his eyes glistened openly beneath the candlelight. "Then God punish me forever," he said hoarsely, "for the greatest lie I have ever spoken." Tears slipped silently down Eleanor's cheeks. "I was afraid," Cedric continued. "Not of our child. Never of our child. I feared loving someone so completely that losing them would destroy whatever remained of me. Yet losing you now," his voice broke entirely, "it has already begun." For the first time since their marriage, Eleanor saw no trace of performance within him. There was no duke before her now, no cold aristocrat hiding behind etiquette and restraint. Only a wounded man finally surrendering every defense pride had ever built around his heart. She lifted trembling fingers weakly against his cheek. "You are not your father," she whispered. Cedric closed his eyes briefly at the words, overcome by emotion too large for speech. Then another violent pain overtook Eleanor, and panic returned instantly to the room. The physician's expression darkened. "Your Grace, the child is in distress." Everything afterward dissolved into feverish urgency. Servants rushed fresh linens into the chamber while rain hammered mercilessly against the windows. Eleanor cried out weakly, her strength nearly gone. Cedric refused to release her hand even as blood stained his cuff. "Stay with me," he pleaded softly beside her ear. "Please, Eleanor. I would surrender every title, every acre of this cursed estate, if only heaven spares you." A final terrible silence suddenly fell across the chamber. Then came the sharp, fragile cry of a newborn child. The sound pierced the storm itself. Cedric staggered backward in stunned disbelief while the physician carefully lifted the infant wrapped in white linen. Tiny cries filled the room with miraculous life after endless hours of dread. "It is a son," the doctor announced breathlessly. Outside the chamber, servants quietly wept with relief while distant church bells announced dawn across the countryside. Yet within Cedric's chest, hope and terror collided violently enough that he could scarcely remain standing beside the bed destined to become grave. But Cedric scarcely heard him. His attention remained fixed entirely upon Eleanor. She lay motionless against the pillows, her eyes closed, her skin pale as winter moonlight beneath the trembling candles. And no matter how desperately Cedric called her name, she did not awaken. Morning arrived slowly over Ravensshire estate, pale and exhausted after the violence of the storm. Frost clung to the tall windows while silence settled heavily through the manor corridors where servants moved with subdued footsteps and lowered eyes. No one spoke above a whisper. The joy of the newborn heir had become inseparable from the fear haunting the Duchess's chamber. Cedric had not left Eleanor's bedside for 2 days. The physicians urged him repeatedly to rest, yet exhaustion seemed irrelevant beside the terror consuming him. He remained seated near the bed with their infant son cradled carefully against his chest, staring endlessly at Eleanor's unmoving face as though devotion alone might summon her back from whatever distant darkness held her captive. The child slept quietly most hours, wrapped in cream-colored blankets embroidered hastily by trembling servants during the night of his birth. Occasionally the infant opened startling gray eyes that already resembled Cedric's own. Each glimpse pierced the Duke with unbearable tenderness and equally unbearable guilt. He had nearly lost them both. Rain no longer battered the estate, yet the memory of Eleanor's cries lingered within every corridor. Cedric heard them whenever the clocks chimed. He heard them in the crackling fireplaces and the rustle of curtains shifting beneath winter drafts. Most cruelly, he continued hearing his own voice from that ballroom at Blackthorn Manor. "I do not want this child." The sentence had become a curse haunting every breath. Late one evening, Beatrice entered the chamber carrying fresh candles and paused upon seeing Cedric asleep beside the bed with the infant resting against his shoulder. The Duke's posture remained protective even in exhaustion. One arm curved instinctively around the child while his other hand still clasped Eleanor's motionless fingers. Beatrice approached quietly. "You cannot continue like this." Cedric awakened instantly. "How long was I asleep?" "Perhaps 20 minutes. He looked immediately toward Eleanor before answering anything further. Relief and despair warred visibly across his face when he found her condition unchanged. The physician entered moments later carrying medicine bottles and folded linens. His expression remained carefully neutral, which frightened Cedric more than grimness would have. "There has been no improvement?" Cedric asked. "She breathes steadily," the physician replied gently. "Beyond that, only time may assist her now." After the physician departed, Cedric stood beside the window overlooking snow-covered gardens where dead roses protruded through frost like memories refusing burial. He looked older somehow. The rigid elegance once admired throughout London had eroded beneath sleepless nights and relentless remorse. "I spent years believing power protected men from helplessness," he said quietly without turning. "Yet I would bargain away every title my family possesses if it purchased one moment more of her voice." Beatrice studied him carefully. "Then perhaps suffering has finally taught you what love could not." The words struck deeply because they were true. That night, after the household retired into uneasy silence, Cedric carried the infant toward the fireplace and began reading aloud from one of Eleanor's favorite poetry collections. His voice remained rough with exhaustion, yet each word emerged with quiet reverence while firelight flickered across the sleeping child. "When sorrow sleeps beside the heart," he read softly, "hope must keep vigil where joy no longer dares remain." He glanced toward Eleanor afterward as though waiting for some invisible sign. Nothing changed. Still he continued reading. Hour after hour he spoke poetry into the silence, telling stories between verses about the child resting in his arms. He described how stubbornly the boy clenched tiny fists and how his eyes searched rooms with solemn curiosity already resembling his mother's intelligence more than his father's severity. "You should know," Cedric whispered toward the bed. "He dislikes being away from your side. The nurses cannot soothe him half so quickly." Emotion tightened his throat unexpectedly. "I suspect he already loves you beyond reason," he murmured. Days passed. News of the Duke's transformation spread through London with astonishing speed. Society, once delighted by Eleanor's humiliation, became captivated instead by rumors of Cedric Ravenshire refusing Parliament meetings, ignoring aristocratic obligations, and spending every waking hour beside his unconscious wife and newborn son. Some dismissed the stories as sentimental exaggeration. Others quietly wondered whether genuine love had finally conquered the icy restraint for which the Duke had become infamous. Countess Mortimer remained unimpressed. She arrived at Ravensshire Estate one bitter afternoon beneath the pretense of offering condolences, though malice glittered beneath her polished sympathy. Cedric received her reluctantly inside the drawing room while snow drifted beyond the windows. "How tragic," she sighed dramatically. "One almost fears the Duchess lacked sufficient constitution for motherhood." Cedric's expression darkened instantly. Countess Mortimer continued sipping tea delicately. "Still, society shall recover from the scandal eventually. Men of your position often remarry rather quickly." The silence afterward became lethal. Cedric set down his teacup with terrifying calm before crossing toward her slowly. "You will leave this estate immediately." The Countess blinked in surprise. Your Grace. You fed upon my wife's suffering for amusement, he said coldly. You transformed private grief into entertainment because cruelty offered excitement to your empty existence. His voice lowered dangerously. If your carriage remains upon Ravensshire grounds within 5 minutes, I shall ensure every door in London closes permanently against you. For once in her life, Countess Mortimer looked genuinely afraid. She departed without another word. That evening, Cedric returned upstairs carrying fresh roses gathered personally from the estate greenhouse where gardeners struggled to preserve winter blooms against the frost. He placed them beside Eleanor carefully before sinking into the chair near her bed once more. I spent too much of my life becoming a man my father would admire, he confessed quietly into the dim candlelight. And in doing so, I nearly destroyed the only soul who ever loved me without fear. The infant stirred softly within his cradle nearby. Cedric looked toward his son with aching tenderness. I shall not repeat those mistakes with him, he vowed. He will know kindness before discipline. He will never question whether he is wanted. Emotion overtook him suddenly then, violent enough to steal breath from his chest. He bowed his head beside Eleanor's hand and wept openly for the first time since childhood, every ounce of pride finally shattered beneath grief and devotion. A faint movement interrupted the silence. Cedric froze. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Eleanor's fingers tightened weakly around his. He lifted his head at once, stunned disbelief flooding his face. Eleanor? Her lashes fluttered faintly against pale skin before her eyes opened with exhausted slowness. Confusion lingered there briefly until recognition softened her expression. Cedric looked as though heaven itself had returned the dead. You came back, he whispered brokenly. Eleanor studied him quietly. The proud duke who once wounded her with 5 cruel words now appeared utterly undone before her, hollowed by fear, sleeplessness, and remorse. I heard your voice, she murmured weakly, reading beside the fire. Relief nearly brought Cedric to his knees again. He pressed trembling kisses against her hand while tears escaped him without restraint. I thought I had lost you. You almost did. The honesty of the reply pierced them both. For several moments neither spoke while winter light spilled softly through the curtains and their infant son stirred nearby with tiny restless sounds. At last Cedric lifted the child carefully into Eleanor's arms. Her face transformed instantly upon seeing him clearly for the first time. He is beautiful, she whispered tearfully. He has your eyes. Eleanor looked toward Cedric again, and although pain still lingered between them, something gentler now existed beside it. Not perfect forgiveness, not forgotten wounds, but the fragile beginning of healing earned through suffering rather than promises. What shall we name him? She asked softly. Cedric touched the child's small hand reverently. Theodore, he answered. A gift from God neither of us deserved, yet somehow received. Spring arrived gradually over Ravensshire months later, melting frost from the gardens and awakening pale roses beneath golden sunlight. London society continued gossiping endlessly, though its voices no longer reached the quiet countryside where Cedric chose to keep his family far from aristocratic cruelty. One warm afternoon, Eleanor stood beneath blooming arches watching Cedric kneel in the grass beside their laughing son. The child reached eagerly toward butterflies drifting through the roses while Cedric smiled with unguarded warmth Eleanor once feared he would never possess. He looked up then and met her gaze across the garden. No words passed between them. None were needed. Because sometimes love survived not by remaining untouched, but by enduring long enough for broken hearts to learn tenderness after ruin.